the international movement for a just world.
Nice to speak to you again, Dr. Chandra. Today what we're going to be talking about is what we see in places like Mali, places like Syria. We see a drive towards the foundation of an Islamic state under very strict Sharia legislation. So what I just want to ask is, what are your reasons? What do you think the reasons are behind this push?
Thank you very much, Niall. It's a pleasure to do another interview with you. There are, I think, various reasons which explain this drive. If one had to generalize what's happening in Mali, if you look at some of the militant groups, if you look at the militant groups in Syria, and before that, don't forget Libya, which in a sense is connected with what's happening in Mali. And if you look at what has been happening in perhaps other parts of the Muslim world, you have similar groups, and going back a little in history, Afghanistan under Soviet occupation, the reaction to it. One could perhaps talk of two forces which are driving Islamic groups of this sort. Number one, it's domestic, meaning by which it is internal to Muslim societies. There are Muslim groups who are committed to the idea of a caliphate, to an Islamic state, which they feel should be guided by Sharia, interpreted in a certain way, and where hudud, meaning by which the Islamic penal code will play a very significant role. These are some aspects of their thinking, and invariably their thinking also would relate to the role of women in society, the relationship between men and women. It would be connected with culture, entertainment, music, things of that sort. They'd be very concerned about establishing what they see as a highly moral society. So there is a certain puritanical drive in these movements. So it's something which comes from within Muslim history, it comes from within Muslim societies, meaning by which it is a product of a certain interpretation of the religion. There's no doubt about it at all. And this interpretation has been strengthened by the role of the religious elites over a long period of time. It's, in a sense, a part of what I call the 3 T's in Islam: tradition, teacher, and text. This is what has shaped this particular interpretation of the religion. What is dangerous is when people argue that this is Islam, as if this represents the essence of Islam. It doesn't. It is the product of a particular tradition, a particular text, and a particular teacher, if you like, in the broad sense. So that's from within the religion. The external factor is related to global politics. It is a product of dominance and control, Western imperialism. If you look at the case of Libya, one of the reasons why these rebels are very, very angry is because of the role of France. And if you look at Syria, there's no doubt at all. There is the role of Western powers and their regional allies who have that particular interpretation of Islam. They've come together. And if you look at Afghanistan, it was the Soviet occupation. Again, an external force. So there is an external dimension which strengthens this particular drive towards a very strict puritanical interpretation of Islam.
Sure. Now, what I think we've spoken about a little bit was an emphasis on prohibition and punishment in this kind of society. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays into how the society is constructed?
Yeah. You will find that invariably these groups which have a certain fidelity to tradition, text, and teacher, and these groups that interpret Islam in a certain way, and sometimes they choose the militant path, sometimes they choose some other path that is less militant, but basically there is a certain mindset. And that mindset has these two characteristics: prohibit and punish. meaning by which, you tell people, don't do this, don't do that, this is wrong. And it would be in relation to attire, in relation to intergender mixing, it may be in relation to education, it may be in relation to culture. Prohibition is very important. And the way in which they would ensure that there is conformity is through punishment. So you have to punish people if they don't toe the line. So punishment becomes very important, hence the emphasis upon hudud. The emphasis upon hudud, the penal code in Islam, interpreted in their way, is basically punishment. It means that you have to ensure that things are done. If they can't be done in a certain way, then you punish them. You chop off a person's hand, you crucify the highway robber, you put the adulterer and the adulteress to death, and do things of that sort. It's all punishment. So punishment and prohibition figure very prominently in their thinking, when actually for those of us who have a different approach to Islam, it is education and enlightenment. 2 E's, not 2 P's, as against the 2 P's. For us, 2 E's are more important. You educate, you enlighten people. You make them understand the importance of certain values, and these are the broad humanistic values that all human beings share. Justice, love, compassion, a sense of dignity. These are the values which all human beings share. So that should be the emphasis, and that comes from education and enlightenment.
As we had mentioned, as you had mentioned before, oftentimes these movements come out of a form of resistance or resisting external factors. Can you talk a little bit about resistance and non-violent resistance?
Yes. Well, resistance plays a very important role in these movements. If you look at Palestine, for instance, it is undoubtedly true that Hamas, as an Islamic movement, it derives its legitimacy from resistance, and Hamas also resorts to force, and it legitimizes its force because the Palestinians are an occupied people. But even if there was no legitimacy to that sort of resistance, it is quite possible that some of those who resist would resort to violence because they feel that that is part of resistance. And there are other movements who resist the aggressor, the occupier, in ways which are perhaps more acceptable to people. In other words, they define violence in a very strict way, like in the case of the Hezbollah. And you find that the Hezbollah, for instance, has never attempted to hijack a plane or commit violence outside Lebanon. This has been their approach, Lebanon and Palestine, Israel. This has been the way in which they have defined their struggle. But we have to go beyond violent resistance. We have to look at non-violent resistance. Of course, there's always been a non-violent resistance in the Palestinian struggle, right from the beginning. And even before the establishment of the State of Israel, don't forget 1936, the Palestinian Arab uprising was largely non-violent. So non-violence has also played a very, very big role in all these resistance movements that we have been talking about. And if you look at, say, even Iraq, the resistance to US occupation since 2003, there was violent resistance, there was also non-violent resistance, massive pamphleteering and all the rest of it. Yeah? So non-violent resistance has also played a very big role that is not recognized by a lot of Muslims and also people outside the Muslim world. If you look at the Iranian Revolution, it was largely non-violent, the overthrow of the Shah. If you look at, for instance, what had happened in Indonesia in 1998, the overthrow of President Suharto, dictatorship, 32 years, deeply entrenched. The movement that overthrew Suharto was largely non-violent. And if you look outside the Muslim world, there are many other examples too. Philippines, the resistance against Ferdinand Marcos, non-violent. Eastern Europe, 1989, most of the movements were very, very non-violent. So I think non-violence has played a very big role in shaping the world. And we should recognize this.
Now, if we want to look at Islamic governance, you had mentioned a split between an emphasis on punishment and an emphasis on education. So, in your view, what would an alternative model look like of Islamic governance?
Let me state this at the outset, that I think that genuine Islamic governance, if it is faithful to the supreme values and principles of the Quran, of God's revelation as Muslims see it, its ultimate aim would be to enhance the dignity of the human being, regardless of who the human being is. In other words, genuine Islamic governance, and this is the irony, would go beyond Islam. It would talk about the human being, about the common path that all of us have to traverse as human beings, our common destiny. We will all die one day. That's our common destiny. Our common destiny is, the struggle against all sorts of forces, day in and day out. That's our common destiny as human beings. As human beings, all of us, there are many things that we have to do and many things that we don't do that are part of our lot as human beings. I think this is what we have to realize, because our ultimate identity is our human identity, and that transcends all our other identities. And if you look at many of the new scientific studies that have emerged, this is what these studies emphasize, that there is a human identity beyond all our other identities. If you look at us in terms of our genetic makeup, we are very, very similar. It doesn't matter what culture, religion, nationality we come from, we are very, very similar. And if you look at joys and sorrows, if you look at the way in which people address tragedies and triumphs in their lives, there's not much difference. So I think this is the real aim of a genuine Islamic society, to move human beings in that direction. Unfortunately, none of the Islamic movements that I know at the moment are committed to that.